Hello everyone, my name is Chris and I'm a technical assistant with the Okanagan Regional Library. Today I'm going to give you an overview of the tools in Photoshop and show how you can use the paintbrush tools to create a digital painting using either a mouse or a digitizing drawing tablet. In case you're not familiar, Photoshop's an industry standard professional grade tool used by photographers, designers, video game artists, and more. You've probably heard of Photoshop as a general term, like, oh, that image is Photoshopped, but Photoshop is actually a trademark of the Adobe Corporation. It's their image editing software package. Photoshop is available from adobe.com on a variety of subscription plans, but there are some free tools that mimic Photoshop's features, so if you're on a tight budget, you might want to use one of those tools just to learn the basics and decide if you want to move up to the professional grade software and actually buy Photoshop. Some of those free tools are Gimp, Paint.net, and the online apps sketch.io, Sumopaint, and Pixlr. I'll provide a link to some of those free tools in the description. For now though, I'm going to show you some of the basics of Photoshop. I should note that I'm using Photoshop CS6, the last standalone version of Photoshop. It's quite a few years old now, but most of the tools are exactly the same as the most recent version, Photoshop Creative Cloud. A key feature of Photoshop is the Layers panel, where you can arrange components of an image, including adjustments and filters, so that it's easy to make changes, keep track of things, and build up an image from multiple pieces. The Layers panel is down on the right-hand side. I'll get to that in a minute. First, when we open up Photoshop, you'll see we're given a large blank workspace. We can't paint anything yet. First, we need to create a canvas to draw on. So if I go up to File in the upper left-hand corner, New, now I can create a new canvas and give it a name. So I'm going to call it Test 1. Whoops. Test 1. I can pick from a variety of preset sizes, including US paper size, which is 8.5 by 11 inches, or I can specify the pixel dimensions and the resolution of the image I'd like to create. I'm going to be creating a canvas that's 3,840 by 2,160 pixels wide, and I hit OK, and it'll give me that canvas that I can start painting on. Over in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see that the layers in this image are on display. Right now there's only one layer, that's the background layer. And if I were to hit the delete key and try and delete this layer, it won't let me, because there always has to be at least one layer in a Photoshop image. If I click on this Create a New Layer button, so that's all the way down on the lower right-hand corner, you can see it adds a new layer on top of the background, and if I continue clicking that button, it's creating an array of layers, and the most recently created layer is active. You can see that's got these little white brackets around it here. I'll highlight that with my mouse. That's the active layer. So if I were to draw anything on this layer, I'm just going to select the paintbrush tool. If I were to draw anything on this layer, the marks that I'm making are not going to appear on the other layers. Imagine these as clear transparencies stacked one atop the other. I can delete layers by hitting the delete key or the trash can button in the absolute lower right hand corner. If I click that, it asks me, do I really want to delete it? Yes. And I'm back to having three layers, the background, layer 1, and layer 2. I can continue hitting delete until I'm back down to a single layer. Now if I create several layers, the next button over from the Create New Layer button, again that's down on the bottom right hand corner, is the Create a New Group button. This allows me to group layers, so if I hold down the Shift key and select each of the layers that I want to combine, and then drag them on top of my group. There we go. Let go. Those three layers have now been added to this group folder. This makes it really easy to keep track of layers and divide up an image so that everything's in an easy to find location. If I click the eye on the left hand side of this Layers panel, it hides the layer. So if I start drawing a few little marks on these layers, if I hide these layers individually, the marks go away. Well, they're still there. It's just that the layers are temporarily invisible. If I turn them back on by clicking on that eye icon, everything comes back. I can also turn off temporarily, or make invisible, all of those layers by making their group invisible. There we go. If I select Control A, it gives me this marching ants selection. That's similar to using the selection tool on the upper left to draw a box around the entire image. So Control A is select all. And if I hit delete, that deletes everything on that layer. And you'll see it didn't delete all of the green marks because it's only deleting the things that are on the active layer, which in this case is layer 3. It's not deleting anything on the underlying layers, layer 2 and layer 1. If I want to delete what's on layer 2, I have to make that layer active, and I still have my selection active. You can see that marching ants border around the canvas. Now if I hit delete, it's going to delete everything on the active layer within this selection. Boom. Now if I move down a layer, I'll delete this next piece of green on layer 1. Done. If I want to get rid of this selection, I usually just click outside of the canvas and my selection disappears. So if I make a selection using the lasso tool or the selection box tool, I can just click outside the canvas and it goes away. Now I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the tools on the left-hand side of the interface. Firstly, we have the Move tool. That's used for selecting objects and moving them around. The Selection tool, this is for making box-shaped selections. This is how you would grab pixels if you want to move them around. And then we'd use the Move tool to move everything within that selection. It's not letting me do this right now because there are no pixels on this layer to actually select and move. Maybe I should paint some. There we go. Now if I select these, there we go. I can move the pixels around. The next tool is the lasso tool. It allows me to freeform select sections and then move them around using the Move tool. There is a shortcut, Control D, to deselect. So if I've selected an object and I move it around, and now I'd like to deselect, I can either click outside of the canvas, or I can hit Control D to deselect that area. The next tool I'd like to talk about is the paintbrush. There we go. Right now I have an airbrush type paintbrush tip selected. Over on the right here, I have the Brush Presets panel. This allows me to select from a variety of different brush tips and effects. I can create my own, which I'll show you later, or I can select brush tips that have previously been created. Let's pick this patterned one. Brush tips can be given a hardness or a softness. They can be given scatter characteristics. They can be made to follow the angle of your pen, almost like calligraphy. There are lots and lots of options. The brush options panel is this one, just above the brush panel. And as you can see, there are tons of options in here for changing how a brush behaves and how it looks. I'm going to select everything, Control A, and delete it. Now I'm back to an empty layer, and I can keep on making examples. The next tool I'd like to talk about is a couple down. That's the Erase tool. It works just like you'd expect an eraser to, and just like the paintbrush tools, the brush tip shape and the hardness of the eraser can be completely customized. The next tool down is the Fill tool. If I hit Fill on one of these layers, it fills the entire canvas with the foreground color. You'll see over here on the lower left, there are two little color swatches. That's the foreground color and the background color. And the little double-ended arrow, if I click on that, it swaps the foreground and background colors back and forth. So with that white color in the foreground now, if I were to hit, or if I were to click on the screen using the paint bucket tool, as you can see, it fills it white because white is the foreground color. If I switch again to green, green is now my foreground color, and I click and the paint bucket fills the screen with green paint. The next tool here is the pen tool, which is used for creating paths. I don't think I'll go into this in much detail. The path feature is something that Adobe Illustrator, another one of Adobe's pieces of software, uses much more extensively. And Photoshop is generally used for creating artwork that's made up of pixels, whereas these pen tools for creating digital paths can create reshapeable paths that can be used to control other tools and create shapes that can be modified later or sized up and down without them getting too pixelated. But I think I'll talk about those later. I'm going to select that whole path and delete it. Next up is the Shapes tool. Here I can drag a variety of shapes, circles, squares, polygons, or I can select the Custom Shape tool, and then in the top center in this drop-down panel I can select a variety of custom shapes, which I can then drag onto my canvas. The next tool here is the Pan tool. It's used for panning the screen back and forth. And the next one is the Zoom tool. So if I were to zoom in by clicking on the canvas, I could then use the Pan tool to move around. A shortcut on the keyboard to get to the Pen tool, if you're currently selecting one of the other tools, is the spacebar key. Every time I hit space, that hand pops up and I can start panning the canvas. This is very handy if you're working with a mouse. Now to zoom so that I can see my entire painting at once, I can right-click and select Fit on Screen. Now my whole canvas is visible on the screen. And I should point out, over on the right-hand side here, this is the Navigator panel, and that red box shows us exactly where we are in the image. So if I were to zoom way in, the Navigator shows me exactly where I am in the image, what part of the image I've zoomed into. So if I zoom in way too much, I can use the Navigator to figure out where I am. Or I can right-click, select Fit to Screen, and I get my whole image back again. I'm going to delete all of these tests here. So I select everything by Control-A, and then I hit delete. And Control-D to get rid of my selection. Control-Z is the undo shortcut on the keyboard, and Control-Alt-Z is the shortcut for multiple undo operations. Photoshop has an array of adjustments and filters that can be made to your painted image or your photographs. If I go over here to Image, so that's on the top toolbar, I can go down to Adjustments, and then I have all of these to choose from. So I can change the brightness and contrast, the levels, that's a little bit like a brightness and contrast adjustment as well. Curves and exposure can also adjust the brightness of an image. Vibrance and hue and saturation can be used to control the colors in the image, same with color balance. I can change it to black and white. I can apply an array of tints like blue and orange photo filters. And there are a whole bunch more. Gradient map is really handy to play with. Let's see. Desaturate turns the image into a grayscale image from color. The next tool over on that toolbar is Layer. This gives me all the options for manipulating the currently selected layer. I don't think I have time to go through all of them, but I'm going to mention these three options at the bottom of the drop-down list: merge down, merge visible, and flatten image. These three are all for dealing with the layers, like these layers over on the right-hand side. If I merge down, as you can see in the layers panel, it has just merged the two layers into one layer. I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that, and I'm going to create a whole stack of layers using that new layer button. I'm going to put a little dot of paint on each layer just so they have something going on. And now if I go up to the upper toolbar and down to flatten image, you'll see it's going to compress all of those layers down onto the background. So this is a handy final operation if you're happy with your image and you want to squish it all down into one layer. I tend to save my images as Photoshop format with all of my layers intact, just in case I have to go back and make some changes later. That's very hard to do if everything's been flattened down into a single layer. The type toolbar is for adjusting type and lettering and fonts. The selection toolbar is for manipulating a selection, so if I use the lasso tool to make a selection, there are more options that have become available to me on the select toolbar. The ones I use most are probably deselect and inverse. When I hit inverse selection, instead of selecting that little bean shape in the center, it's actually selected everything else instead. And if I invert it again, I'm back to my original selection. I generally use basic image adjustments like vibrance, exposure, brightness and contrast, levels, color balance, and hue and saturation for changing the colors of my image. Let me show you what color balance does. Here I can choose the amount of cyan, red, magenta, green, yellow, and blue in my image, based on the highlights, midtones, and shadows in the image. So if I want my shadows to be a lot more blue, I toggle the shadows radio button and then move the slider towards blue. If I want my midtones to be more red, I select that midtones radio button and move the slider towards red. If I want my highlights to be very yellow, I select that highlights radio button and change my highlights to be more yellow. Well, that looks pretty good. If I do an undo operation, Control-Z, you'll see it's made quite a difference. And then if I want to redo this, I can go Edit, Redo Color Balance. And that's the difference it's made to the image. I quite like that. So I'm going to save it as a duplicate. Looks like we're out of time today. Thanks for joining me. And next time I'm going to dig into exactly how I created that digital landscape painting with the trees and the mountains using just the lasso tool for selections and some custom paintbrushes that I made up as I went along. And check out the other videos on this channel as we add new content related to science, technology, engineering, arts, and math.